Afternoon. And again, welcome to the Middle East Institute. I'm Wendy Chamberlain. I run this place, and I'm very proud of it and proud of my scholars who work here, who you'll listen to this afternoon. We're really very pleased to be able to host this film screening and discussion about a population that is largely forgotten right now in the Middle East. You know, as we all read the press about Syria, it's easy to think that it's about the Russians and the Turks and the Syrians and the Israelis and the different groups. But there are a lot of Syrian civilians who are caught up in this nightmare in Syria today and who are suffering some unspeakable human rights abuses and violations as detainees, some of them by the Assad regime, some of them by various groups as they have been incarcerated. We're going to discuss that today. We're going to see a film that will shed some light on what they're going through. The panel today will be moderated by the Middle East Institute's resident scholar, our own Ibrahim Asli, who himself was detained in Syria years ago. He is also a non-resident scholar at the Orient Research Center in Dubai. And Ibrahim focuses on, of course, the Syrian conflict, but with an emphasis on security, civil society, political Islam, and political economy. We're honored to have Mohammed al-Abdullah, who was also a political prisoner in Syria. He does some very significant research on human rights and democracy. He's a human rights activist. He was previously a research assistant at the Human Rights Watch in Beirut, and will have much to say on the panel this afternoon. Miriam Jalabi is a founding member of the Syrian Women's Political Movement. She's co-chair of that organization's Foreign Relations Committee. She's also served on the Women's Advisory Committee for the Syrian High Negotiations Committee, and she's a founding member of the Syrian Nonviolence Movement. And finally, Rod Jarar will provide a larger look at the international human rights perspective. Rod is an Arab-American architect. He's a blogger. He's a political advocate based here in Washington, D.C. And before we begin, if I could just do some housekeeping. If you have your phone, please mute it. We're taping this. We're filming this. And we don't want to hear your phone go off. But keep your phone on because we hope you tweet. And you can tweet at hashtag MEI Syria. For those of you who don't already know it, and I think most of you do, this is our temporary home while the Middle East Institute rebuilds our permanent headquarters, which is right around the corner on N Street. If you go there, you'll look, they're pouring the concrete now on the foundation. It's all very exciting. It'll be more than double, about 140% larger than it had been before. And it will be completed about this time next year. So it's all very exciting. That costs money. So if you're a regular participant in our events and like what you come to, please grab a pamphlet on your way out to explain a little bit more about our renovation and our expansion. And I have a little pledge card. And we greatly appreciate that because we don't get money from the government. We don't rely on OMB, so we're not even cut 30%. 30% of zero is zero. So thank you very much. Let's begin.
Ambassador Chamberlain, thank you very much for this great introduction. And hello, everyone. Welcome to MEI, and thank you very much for being here today. I just want to say a few words about the documentary before we start. Save the Rest is a Syrian campaign that works to shed light on the Syrian detainees. And in this documentary, they try to document some stories of former detainees in the Syrian prisons, to help us understand and feel what they have been through and what they have experienced under detention. It's powerful and it's certainly devastating. However, the documentary tries to shed a light on a whole dimension of the Syrian conflicts that's usually overlooked by policymakers and the public alike, and probably because the detainees are usually locked away and they are voiceless. And that's exactly what the movie is trying to do, to give them a voice and to connect you on a personal level to the tens of thousands of Syrian detainees. So I do encourage you that while you're watching the documentary, to think about the magnitude of the crisis and of the number of the detainees and about any questions that you might have. Because I'm gonna rejoin you with our esteemed panelists, Muhammad, Mariam, and Raed, after the documentary, and we're gonna try to address some of your questions. Thank you very much again, and let's watch the documentary. You can tell us and explain why there isn't any clear numbers about those who are detained or have been detained at some point in the last few years, and what efforts are being taken by INGOs to document those numbers.
Sure. Thank you very much for having me here, and thanks for MEI for hosting us and for the Syrian nonviolence movement for the documentary. The main problem with the number of detainees is trying to throw an estimate that's both accurate and tells the reality of the numbers and also reflects the updates, who has been detained and who has been released. So a very systematic practice from day one with the Syrian government and the detention issue has been arresting people and releasing some and arresting other people and re-arresting people. Some people killed and they dumped them in graves or in mass graves without really giving the exact documentation to their government, to their families. Putting people in secret detention center has been one of the issues as well, because when at some moment prisons became very crowded and didn't fit people. So certain stadiums and soccer stadiums and certain all the schools were no longer being used as education facilities, turned to become facility for detentions and for torture as well. So there's difficulty in keeping track of who was killed and who's alive and who's not alive, who's still in prison. There's that issue first. And the other thing, there's the tendency to, during the bombing and the killing and the fighting, lots of people died and they didn't have records for them. So there's an assumption that they are all in prison. And that makes the basically throwing exact number on how many people are in prison versus how many people are just missed people and enforcedly disappeared, another difficulty. The issue later, when in 2011 the Syrian government was the leader in killing and torturing and detaining people. 2012-13, when the armed groups start appearing as well, certain armed groups, if not all of them actually, start joining the practice. So every armed group have a detention center and facility. They kidnap people and then they claim they don't know about them, and then there's the summary executions, and certainly that made the situation even more difficult. So for the UN to try to throw a number is impossible. For human rights NGOs, we do our best in interviewing people, but also because of the fear structure the Syrian government managed to implant on every prisoner, a family would reach out to us saying, my husband, my son, etc., in prison, we managed to visit or we didn't manage to visit. When the person is released, nobody will update you, because the first thing they will get is, if you tell anything about their release, we will release them again. So you don't want to really take the risk and throw numbers and then you find out people actually were released after they were in prison. And the government certainly played these techniques to try to kind of secure the results. If you try to look at the numbers of detainees, all the government wants to publish a list saying all those people are missing and detainees of the government, and the government tried to bring those people and appear them in TV and saying, oh, actually they were not in prison, they were released a couple of months ago or last year, just to try to undermine the reliability and credibility of the effort. So what international NGOs tried to do is, and this is what we proposed to the UN Special Envoy, Stefan de Mistura. We participated in a couple of rounds on what's so-called the Civil Society Support Room, supporting the negotiation in Geneva. This was in Geneva 3, 2016. Now, God will, in Geneva 9, and we got nothing done. So in Geneva 3, what we tried to do with the UN is rejecting the approach of list of names and numbers. because it's impossible really to point out exact numbers. This is going to be very difficult. It's going to expose us to lots of pushback from the government and basically trying to undermine the credibility of the documentation. What we proposed is demand and strict demands of access. Somebody need to access these prisons. And what's very integrated in the nature of the life of the security agencies in Syria is the cycle of arrest, disappear, torture, kill, mass grave, or release some people. And this cycle has never, ever been broken anywhere or anytime, from the 70s, from the 60s. And the only place where you can break this chain is to go on access and have access to prisons and try to send monitors, independent monitors, ICRC, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty. Somebody can go in and tell the government, actually, there's some checks here. We come and we see the numbers and the names. You have to have a registry of the people. You cannot use secret detention centers or undesignated detention centers. So that was the first proposal to the UN. We need access, and the UN needs to pressure for access. We cannot continue doing this. The second thing, rejecting the approach of list of names, and all what the UN was overly concerned with, asking the opposition to create their own list of names and asking the government to create their own list of names for the people who they think are imprisoned with the opposition. And the UN Special Envoy offered to swap those. And this is really a disaster plan, because simply the government say we don't have those names, and the opposition say we don't have those names, or they acknowledge some people and not acknowledging everybody in prison. And we're not going to end up in anything. The max we're going to end up with swapping the people their name managed to arrive to the list or make it to the list. But there's other thousands of people where their names are not actually on anybody's list because the families are scared, they don't want to talk to anyone, or they live in a rural area, or they don't have the methods and mechanism. So the access to the prison, dropping the list of names and swapping the list of names and numbers, and separating the detention and the discussion and detainees from the political track. And what de Mistura did, and de Mistura is responsible for what continuously is happening, is attaching the detainees issue to his political negotiation. So unless we reach a political solution for the whole Syrian conflict, those people remain as hostages with the Syrian government and with the opposition. And we don't have really any solution for that now. We tried to pressure the UN to appoint a special envoy or special advisor on the detainees issue, which de Mistura did that. He hired somebody, a former ICRC senior person. She stayed for a year and she's done nothing, and then she resigned. And now we have a new special advisor to the UN on the detainees issue. But still, the detainees issue and link it to the political debate is very dangerous. And to make things more interesting, carrying the detainees file and take it to Astana in Kazakhstan, to the negotiation that the Russians are designing as a replacement, or basically as a replacement of Geneva platform. We don't want the UN-sponsored negotiation in Geneva. Let's go to Astana and then later to Sochi in Russia, and let's discuss these issues there. And every time you approach the UN in this, the answer we get, it's really unfortunate. The Russians doesn't want to talk about this. And of course, the Russians don't want to talk about this, but that's not the UN job, actually, to cater to what Moscow want to talk about or not talking about. So I don't want to do long.
Oh, no, thank you.
Really,
I just have another question, talking about the political negotiations. So now there is that discussion of the importance of working on the constitution, and there is a working group that was, I think, established in Sochi in Russia, and now it's going to take place also its work in Geneva. So do you think working on the constitution would help? Two of the interviewees mentioned courts and how they were treated in those courts. So would you speak more a little bit about that and the judiciary sector in Syria?
Sure. In 2006, I ended up in prison. That was the second time I'm in prison. Mainly because I was among another human rights activists. We were trying to mobilize and lobby against the State Security Court. The State Security Court, it's basically kind of a special court the government used to put everybody in prison, opposition, activists, writers, students. If you're against the government, you're going to appear before the State Security Court. There's no appeal, no due processes. You cannot get a lawyer. The judge is actually a military officer, is not a judge with a law degree. And eventually, for lobbying against the court, I ended up in the court as a prisoner later. And the first thing I requested was, I want to see a lawyer. And the prosecutor told me, and this is documented in Stomny, I appeared in Geneva before the Committee Against Torture. The judge told me, oh, this is not a real court, what you study in law school. This is just quick procedures. We have summary procedures here. So that's exactly what the government do. They try to legalize the detention of people, putting them through courts or judgments, but it's not the regular court. After lots of pressures, we were transferred to the criminal court, from the criminal court to the military court. When I asked the judge, why you have jurisdiction over a civilian, he didn't have an answer, because he said, because I had a referral from state security intelligence to put you in prison. So this is the whole cycle, how the judiciary in Syria work. The government abolished the State Security Court in 2012, and after 1 month only re-established what's so-called the Counterterrorism Court. Special procedures, you cannot really ask your file to be copied by your lawyer. You cannot get a copy of your documentation. If I want to prepare a defense for somebody, I need some paper. You cannot prepare that. You can look over some things inside the court. You don't have the chance of appeal, of course. Allegation of torture by the victims or the prisoners will not really prevent the judge from using the testimonies and the confessions as evidence in the trial. So we're not really talking about justice sector here when we talk about state security court or later about counterterrorism court. The people who were lucky more ended up with the regular criminal court or with the military court. They had a better chance. They had ability to appeal, have a lawyer, to get regular visits, etc. And the whole practice of putting people in prison and disappearing them, lots of people were released from prison after getting 10 or 15 years in counterterrorism court. Like, based on what you release somebody, you just put him in prison in a judgment for 10 or 15 years without really revoking that or giving him the chance of appeal. So there's nothing really legal there. There's nothing full international law. And the guarantees on these trials are almost zero. You're going to get anything near to fair trial.
Thank you, Mohammed. And just to clarify this, you said that the movie produced by the Syrian violence movement is produced by the Save the Race.
Save the Race,
just,
sorry.
Yeah, just to give them credit. I would like to move to the other end of the table, to you, Mariam. We're talking about at least tens of thousands of detainees and probably more. What are the ramifications on the society? Because we're talking about tens of thousands of families as well, right? So how is that affecting the Syrian society?
Thank you for having me here, Rahim. Thank you for MEI. I think detention has been not just a tool for torture, terrorizing, and dismantling the fabric of the Syrian society since 2011. It has actually been practiced way before, since Assad, the father, was in power. So this is a tool that has been used in order to keep society in control, in check. I remember living in Syria when I was a child, that it was the scariest thing. If somebody gets arrested, you don't know what happens to them. You don't know where they went. There is no system, no rule of law to actually follow up to know where somebody is. Family members that were arrested from my family, we would look for and we try to find where they were, and we have no record, as you've seen in the movie. They become numbers. When you become a number, you're dehumanized. Your rights are all taken away. You become a number. And I would like to make it a little bit human. Just sitting on this panel, I want to remind everyone of one person. There are thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands that are missing. But there's one person who was with us, a founding member for the nonviolence movement, who is a very active person right from the beginning of the revolution and read a lot of demonstrations. I'd like you to remember Yahya Shurbaji. Yahya Shurbaji is also a family, from the same family as Majd. He's still in prison. We don't know what happened to him. His cousin Nabil Shurbaji was arrested later. Nabil Shurbaji. Yahya Shurbaji. Remember these names. These are human beings. There are hundreds of thousands of people that are like that. Nabil Shurbaji has not survived. His death news came to us last year. He didn't make it, a dear friend. So many others. And when we're talking about detainees, we're not talking about them. We're talking about the mothers, the fathers, the wives, the husband, the children they've left behind. There are so many other ramifications to the detention of one person. And this is something not being talked about enough, like Mohammed now just said. It's not even close to being put forward in the right way in the international community. It's used as a political tactic, as a political tool that negotiations are happening with. These are lives of people that extrapolate to so many others. One detainee has I don't know, tens of others of people that are connected to them, that suffer every day because of their detention. I would like to remember them all. And we need to find a way of how in this Syrian crisis we still have not seen a light in the tunnel for solving it, that at least we start somewhere where we can have a little bit of accountability or a little bit of a light to be seen by, like Muhammad said earlier, by sending monitoring groups to go inside Syria from any organizations, it doesn't matter who's doing it, to shed some of the light of what's happening inside, to take a little bit of the impunity that the regime feels by arresting and detaining everyone that they see slightly of a threat because they're becoming human beings. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariam. Another quick question. You are one of the founders of the Syrian women political movement. Are there any certain activities the movement is working on for the female detainees inside Syria? Are you trying to document the number or to get in touch with them, to any activities?
Majid Shirbaji, actually, the one in the movie, is member of the Syrian Women Political Movement. She's very active with us. There are activities that have been done. I don't know if you've seen, there is a movie later that recently came out that's called Sarkha al-Maktuma, or al-Makbuta, the restrained scream, where it's talking about the systematic rape of women inside Assad prisons and what are the ramifications on women and their lives when they come back into society and what that does. So we have been in touch with them, and one of the things that we feel, we as Syrian Women Political Movement, that we need to bring this to light and bring it into the political arena, that these are things, unless women's security is guaranteed and women's rights are guaranteed, who are 50% of society, there is no way we can go forward with a legitimate and a credible political solution for Syria. And this is one of our aims as Syrian Women Political Movement, is that to shed light more and more on these kind of cases and issues that pertain specifically to women and women's rights, again, 50% of society.
Thank you, Mariam. Raed, Amnesty is one of those few international organizations that worked on the issue of the Syrian detainees and tried to document the numbers and to tell what's going on in those black holes. Nobody knows what's going on, like Sadnaya prison. And there was the report, one of the interviewees also mentioned. Can you please tell us more about that report and the numbers, your findings, and the mechanism, how you worked on that report?
Sure. So, my name is Raed Jarrar. I lead the Middle East and North Africa work with Amnesty International USA. As Ibrahim mentioned, Amnesty International produced a report last year about the Saydnaya prison, and it got a lot of media coverage. We actually have an interactive website now that you all can visit. It's saydnaya.amnesty.org. So it's a web page that we created with Forensic Architecture, a partner organization that helped create a 3D model of the prison. So you can actually navigate inside the prison's hallways and cells, and there are stories of detainees and their interviews that you can actually read there. It's very heavy. I mean, I would say, like what we saw with the documentary today, Alive in Graves, there are these unbelievable stories, especially for the majority of US audiences. The level of suffering and torture is really hard to grasp for anyone who's outside of that context. Amnesty International found that the decisions to torture many of these detainees, to execute them, might amount to crimes against humanity and war crimes. They go up to the top level of the Syrian government. So these are not things that happen by mistake. They're not things that happen because of a mean prison, warden. These are systemic issues. Also, the whole situation with Saydnaya is definitely an emblematic case that shows how prisons are run in Syria at large. It's not an exception, it's more of an example. So in addition to the testimonies that we got about the details of torture, very gruesome details about torture and executions. We also got a few numbers of estimates of how many people have been killed. The official number that Amnesty International came up with last year was around 13,000, up to 13,000 Syrians, mostly civilians, were executed in the prison. So somewhere between 50 and 70 a week that were executed with no due process inside the prison.
Is that in
Inside
that
Naya by itself.
only in one prison?
Yes.
That number, okay.
So there is more information about that. I encourage your audiences to check our website. There is a special web page for Saidnaya. So it's saidnaya.amnesty.org. And it contains our report. It contains the interactive models there.
Thanks, Raed. And another question before we open the floor for Q&A about accountability. Mohammed also mentioned that within the political process, many parties are pushing towards to postpone the issue of detainees. They say, let's discuss, give more priorities to other issues. Do you think it's possible to reach peace in Syria without talking about the issue and the file of detainees and solving this problem?
Amnesty International usually steers away from like political reconciliation procedures. I personally don't think we can avoid talking about the issue of detainees for many reasons. You know, there are the tens of thousands of families who are searching for their loved ones. Amnesty has a separate project for the enforced disappearance of Syrian detainees. It's called Tens of Thousands. So it's also, we also have a web page. We like to have different web pages for everything. So tensofthousands.amnesty.org, and it's a separate exhibit with interviews with Syrian families who have been searching for their loved ones. Now, according to our partner estimates and numbers that Amnesty tried to vet, we estimate the number of disappeared people in Syria to be over 75,000 these are the ones who were disappeared by the Syrian government. There are a couple more thousand people who seem to have been disappeared by armed groups, including ISIS. So it's definitely a very hot topic issue. If you read the testimonies of the families that we have gathered online, you know, these are issues that people live through every day. You know, the effects of having tens of thousands of people disappeared. Actually, the ripple effect affects millions of people outside this, you know, like a neighbor, a cousin, like everyone knows someone who has disappeared. Everyone who's searching for someone who's disappeared. So it's definitely a huge issue that will have to be addressed at one point. I do encourage your audiences to check our tens of thousands exhibit. It's like the documentary. I think one thing that Amnesty International likes to do is tell very complex stories about, you know, civil wars and torture and crimes against humanity by telling the story of individuals. And I think the documentary was very good at you know, boiling that down to us on what does that mean for one human being. I think the Tens of Thousands exhibit also tries to do the same, which it tells the stories of these families who are searching for their loved ones.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. We just heard 3 stories, and we really felt how heavy and powerful they are. So we're talking about here about tens of thousands of similar stories. We have about 15 minutes for Q&A. We're going to conclude before 1:15. Please, if you have a question, raise your hand. There is a mic somewhere in the room. That's the mic. Please introduce yourself and your affiliation before the question. We're going to start with you, please. And
my name is Jumana Kaddour, and I'm a policy analyst at the Commission on International Religious Freedom. Thank you all for your comments. I had a couple of questions, one question for each of you. Hamad, do you mind talking to us a little bit about the Syrian Americans who have been detained by the Syrian government? And if you've heard, I know that there's been tens of Syrian Americans who've been detained and some of whom have died in prison. Do you mind maybe talking a little bit about how you think they got the real actual footage from the video? Or maybe Ibrahim, you know, but if you guys can touch on that. And then Mariam, finally, could you talk to us a little bit about the specific challenges that you mentioned for the women detainees and the ones who have been raped? I know you briefly touched on it, but if you could share with the audience a little bit more of what you've heard. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. Maybe you can
Quickly, I
start.
don't really have exact number of the cases, but I want to mention a couple of the Syrian victims of torture who were basically more or less executed under torture in Syria happened to have a dual citizenship. So a couple of them were either Americans, French, Spanish, so there's a couple of cases now in Europe are alive trying to pursue justice for those people. A lady in Spain saw her brother's picture in what's so-called Caesar photos, the file of thousands of torture images were basically smuggled by a military police photographer. And she filed a lawsuit in Spain, trying under universal jurisdiction for human rights, trying to get some justice. The cases with some difficulties. There's some other cases also in Europe, but that tells basically those people are crying for justice. They're trying to seek any possibility here and there under whatever jurisdiction. Although the odds that somebody will travel to Spain and get arrested there, or there's an Interpol warrant to be enforced and somebody will be extradited, is very, very little. But that tells the victims are trying their best actually to get their voice heard. And of course, filing a case in Europe against officials in Syria for torture, it sheds the light as well about the practice itself and how just a family member will see a loved one disappear, and then there's a military photographer comes with thousands of images of dead bodies and throw them online, and people start looking through those and filtering and see their parents or husband, or so this is really touching, and here's where the international community and also the U.S. can play a role, not necessarily in those specific cases. Now the U.S. is going back to the negotiation in Geneva. They'll be kind of balancing the political scale with Russia, trying to pressure for the detainees issue. Looks like the detainees issue being grasped by the UN, that the Syrian government will not release anyone, because if they release everyone, then you can basically simply do the math and see who's not released is killed, and then start accusing the government of mass killing. So the government wants to reach a peace deal with no accountability, with no justice, and then they'll be more comfortable and inclined to release everyone. And here's where the international pressure on the UN to keep justice and accountability in a peace agreement is important. Otherwise, we're going to end up with a peace agreement like Lebanon, where 100,000 Lebanese were missed from the civil war, still missing till today. And every couple of years, you hear the news about mass grave. I was with the Human Rights Watch mission in Beirut when a lady came and said, there's a mass grave in this street, and there's thousands of people here. So of course, the government brought all their equipment and started digging the street and found nothing. And imagine the mothers and the crying and the scene in the street. It's been almost since Taif agreement, 20, 30 years now. And so reaching a peace agreement doesn't really reveal the truth about those missing people, tell the reality about what happened, bring some justice back to the families, will make reconciliation impossible. We can get a statement signed by both parties of fighting, yes. But as Raad mentioned, we cannot ignore this. Good luck having the community to move forward and work together and live together without addressing all these issues with missing people.
Thank you. Raed, your question, please. It's about the footage.
I have the same
and-
question. Actually, when I saw that, I thought that it's like a B-roll, but then the sign said that it's actual footage.
yeah.
So I'm
Yeah,
not sure.
because actually the government lost control over many prisons in the last few years when they lost control of Aleppo and Idlib and different provinces, and that's how they got the footages from former prisons. Yeah. And one of the prisons actually in Tadmor, unfortunately, it was controlled by ISIS. And it was a prison, I think, active for 40 years or maybe more. And then they actually destroyed it. And they destroyed all the evidences there, unfortunately.
Wow.
Mariam, your question about the challenges for women and rape cases.
Yeah, when I want to talk about raping women or the systematic rape of women, I want to also say that this is not just to women. Men are also sexually abused and raped systematically as a torture tactic inside Assad prisons. And this is something that I believe has been used by all dictatorships, all people who want to destroy a society. So the ramifications for it or the consequences of it for women are a little bit harsher everywhere in society. When a woman comes back out, the first thing she gets asked, I remember hearing a story of a woman saying that she was asked, were you beaten? Were you strip searched? Were you in the, I don't know, in the dulab,
Attire.
The tire, okay, were you raped? It was like, no. It's like, okay, whew, then it's okay. Like everything else that has happened is okay as long as she wasn't raped. And this has different consequences for women when they come back into society. And there's a lot of stories, like if you get the chance to watch this movie, it's very important that you watch it. It's called The Silenced Scream, about the systematic torture of women inside Assad prisons. How when they come out, they're not accepted back into society. In the same way as a man coming out and knowing that he was abused sexually comes out and being taken back into the family and comforted and used. But then again, I do want to stress on the fact that all of these tactics, all of these war crimes committed against humanity for these prisoners inside the prison are used to shame and humiliate, like they were saying. In the prison, there is something that they want to break in you as a person. So them doing this to men and women have very dire consequences. And this has been used over and over again in Assad torture systems.
Thanks, Mariam. Please, the gentleman in the front. Yes, please. And yes.
I'm Peter Humphrey, and I'm an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. It's wonderful that we get to see this in the West, but I feel the power of this kind of film would be much, much greater if it was, for example, translated into Russian, hopefully with yellow subtitles, and Farsi. And then placed on YouTube, placed on the Amnesty International website, placed on Human Rights Watch website. And then a little note at the end. This is what the Iranian government is helping to support, or this is what Vladimir Putin is helping to support. And let those countries know, because I believe those two countries still have enough conscience left to actually affect some change and say, hey, maybe our tax dollars shouldn't be doing this. Is anyone thinking along those lines? Would Amnesty be willing
I can comment on this a little bit.
to put money for translation?
Not necessarily translation. It's more. In 2015, Human Rights Watch gathered the Caesar photos, was handed to them by the military police photographer. They went through the photos. There's some of the photos showing dead bodies being thrown in plastic bags in the backyard of one of the intelligence branches. But it shows some of the elements on the street, and Human Rights Watch managed to geolocate those on the map and match the items, appear the buildings on the map, and show that actually it is the military intelligence branch. The government kept denying, of course. And then there's the mass grave where they were throwing the dead bodies, which is near to the military hospital attached to the branch. And they created a big report with the satellite imageries, with geolocation of those images and matching them on the map, showing these are actually your building and you cannot deny them. And they launched the report from Moscow. For the exact same reason, you try to say, oh, there's some conscience here. Here's what your friend is doing. You're supporting this government, and here's at least a couple of thousand dead bodies in these images with evidence, with names of officers in some of the cases. Changed nothing really with the Russians.
And did you try Iran as well?
Not me. Human Rights Watch did this, but recently I've noticed with Amnesty, with Human Rights Watch, you will see these statements translated to Russian, to Kurdish, to Farsi, trying to engage with the civil society and with the media in those countries. But this is very long advocacy process. You know, just work along these lines, which is a good idea, of course. It's happening. It's not going to get us quick results before those people. So the movie Save the Rest, actually, it means save them before they die under torture, either the conditions or the torture. And that's why more quick action needs to put more pressure and serious pressure on the UN, on the Assad government and the Russians to have a political will to release those people. Waiting till some civil society movements like in Iran, or the protest in Iran was really great in chanting for Syrians in the last couple of weeks, disagreeing with the government for deploying forces and killing Syrians and participating in the violations there. But it's not going to change the Iranian policy or the military engagement of Iran in a couple of regional, a couple of the neighboring country. So that's why we push for the political pressure to be more on the detainees issue. Not only, that's a good advocacy plan itself to complement other political pressure.
And thank you for your suggestions. The activists who worked on the movie, they are not here with us today because most of them are based in Turkey, but they are watching the live stream, and I'm sure they got your suggestions. Thank you very much. Let's take a round of questions, please. The gentleman in the back there, and then the gentleman here.
Hi, my name is Muayyad Al-Bunni. I'm an master's student in Georgetown. Thank you so much for this. And I wanna say that the detainees issue was a local also issue in case of the reconciliation agreements, the so-called reconciliation agreements that were implemented around rural Damascus and in Homs. And it was always thought that there would always be an obstacle towards implementing any of the reconciliation agreements because of the, the tension around this issue. There are families concerned. But at the end, the government managed to establish these reconciliation agreements by the use of force, by the besiegement, by the different strategies that we're probably familiar with. And now we're concerned about the whole national reconciliation in the country. But it's also, there is a way with the whole use of force that they would be able to actually enforce a sort of reconciliation without having resolved this is the issue of the detainees. And I think the issue of the detainees would also impose a serious risk on any democratic kind of democratic change or transformation that we're talking about right now. Is that it's not just a reconciliation issue, it's that how will you ever trust to have any sort of local or national election or any democratic transformation if you have people and families that are terrorized. And the Syrian community society have seen that before. Like in the 80s, you have the families who have lost ones. They never even dare to leave their houses or express their opinions during the revolution or during the events, exactly because of the terror that is in their families. And this is another issue, is that it's not just reconciliation. People might be willing to reconcile because of the amount of terror. I think if you could just talk a little bit about this,
Sure.
especially with
Thank you. Let's take two more questions. Please, the gentleman in the middle, and then the lady.
Hi, Michael Asta. So it's kind of not. So I see in the media and in a lot of people talking, there seems to be a lack of understanding that Assad does not have total control over the areas that are under regime control. It's they give a lot of money to kind of smaller paramilitaries to kind of keep the peace in the region, and the Syrian army is not basically as powerful as CNN makes it seem, or Al Jazeera. And Iran does have a lot of control over Syrian territory compared to how much we think they do. How could that affect the detainees or the prisons, or kind of the future of basically what could happen after a peace deal could be reached when Assad does not have the power and the control of the land that we think he has power over? Thank you.
Thank you. And the last question, the lady in the middle, please.
My name is Kaula. I'm a Syrian attorney and legal fellow at Women Enable. My question is for Raed. It's a follow-up question related to accountability and the 11,000 detainees who died under torture, and you published this report by Amnesty International. I would assume that probably some of them came forward, so the families, so they can seek justice. Does any of those detainees had any dual citizenship? Does any of their families actually came forward to seek justice in Europe, for example, and other countries to pave the road to use universal jurisdiction? Are you in contact with any centers, legal centers, or Syrian attorneys working on those issues?
Thank you. So we have three main points: reconciliation without accountability, without trust, and foreign control over Syria and how that might affect the file of the detainees, and those who have dual citizenship, if that might help to have cases in any courts in European countries. So let's move from Mariam, Raed, and Muhammad, and that will be also if you have any final remarks. And please, we just have 5 more minutes, so probably 1-2 minutes each, please.
Yeah. On reconciliations, there are a lot of deals that are happening between militias, between different groups that are on the ground and the regime. And those are very small scale when you're really thinking about the hundreds of thousands of people that are affected by this mass radical regime in torturing and arresting and working with people. It's very important. People now are accepting things that will not be accepted in 10 years from now. There has to be a sense of accountability, a sense of justice, for people to move on. These things are very important to rebuild the fabric of society, to rebuild the structures of society, because it's not impossible to get like some kind of a peace at the beginning maybe without having a full accountability, but there has to be a promise of full accountability or a look into it. You can't have somebody who's lost their children just sign off something and just to create peace, especially when the peace is actually established, inshallah. When something, develops in Syria, I believe it's totally intertwined and totally working together when you're thinking on a mass scale. But it is very important that we do not stop the reconciliations that can maybe happen right now. And I know there is some ceasefires or some deals that are happening on the ground. Anything that can save civilian lives that could be done right now, of course it is encouraged. And maybe that if there is some kind of a success in it, that it could be extrapolated. But considering that a lot of the deals are made now with, I don't know, Shia militias, Iran militias, like Hezbollah militias, who are not the authority really in Syria. Maybe that goes into the foreign militias or foreign powers that have control over Syria. Then that makes it a very big problem also for the future, where these reconciliations will actually last and not erupt later on in the history of
Thank you, Mariam.
Syria.
Thank you. Raed, please.
I want to comment on the reconciliation issue first, because Amnesty International just issued a report very recently. It's called We Leave or We Die. And the report talks about how these so-called reconciliation agreements are a part of a bigger war machine. It's a war crime machine. So it starts with starvation, using food as a weapon, then intense attacks on civilians, very high-intensity military attacks on besieged areas. Then they pressure inhabitants of these areas to sign agreements. They call them reconciliation agreements. They're more like surrender agreements. And then the fourth step is reconstruction. So Amnesty International's report shows how these so-called reconciliation agreements are not reconciliation agreements. They're agreements as a part of a bigger system of death and destruction, and that even reconstruction might play a role in violating Syrians' human rights. So I really encourage you to read the report. It has very strong recommendations for the US, Russia, Iran, other countries around the world on contributing to the reconstruction process, because the reconstruction, it sounds nice, it's reconstruction, reconciliation, but when you actually see what it actually means, reconstruction might be the last step to make displacement permanent. Now, regarding the question about universal jurisdiction or international mechanisms, I don't know of any cases in the US. Like, I work with Amnesty International USA, but my only comment is that you don't really need to be a dual citizen to benefit from universal jurisdiction or ICC. So, I think Mohammed might have a couple of examples of cases that are happening in Europe.
Thank you. Mohammed, please, in 1 minute.
Also on the reconciliation issue, because we've done a full report on this in 2014. This is before the Mastura came to the UN and decided to follow the local ceasefires plan. And we interviewed lots of people in the besieged areas and outside of Syria. And all the people we interviewed, we have the numbers exactly, I don't remember the exact percentages, but the majority of the people looked at these deals as more or less surrender agreements, not really as reconciliation. And they understood exactly the government want to sign a local ceasefire here so they can be relieved from the fighting here and deploy more forces to the town next to crush that town and force them to a surrender deal and do it. So replicating that model was a disaster. So from the UN to try to engage in such process. And of course, the Mastura came up with the term, they start calling him Mr. Freeze because he wanted to freeze the fighting in Aleppo. And then the whole plan just folded because what happened in Aleppo before the opposition took over, and then the Russian military campaign or Air Force campaign on the city. So we could reach to a peace agreement like Lebanon. It doesn't reconcile anything, puts the country back together, puts everything behind our back and sweep under the rug most of the crimes. The problem is it's not going to be stable, really. It's going to open the country up for more human rights violations. It's going to encourage other parties to involve in future human rights violations because there were no accountability for previous ones. And if you look at what happened with the Syrian government, so when the government was killing and torturing, when the armed groups started forming, nobody respected anything because this is the practice in the country and let's do it. And if you look also at the international community, how they dealt with ISIS and the detainees and missing people inside ISIS prison. The US allowed those to be dragged with ISIS in the deal that the US struck with ISIS to evacuate Raqqa. There's 400 people were taken as more or less human shields when ISIS withdrew from Raqqa, and nobody cared where those people. There's Father Paulo Coelho, the Syrian-Italian priest, who went to ISIS, tried to encourage them to release prisoners, and he disappeared there. There's activists, singer, doctors, field hospital activists. So all those people were just ignored because we want to strike a deal and we want to win militarily and defeat ISIS quickly. So when you put other priorities on top of these human rights issues, you're going to end up with bad deals, really. And if you look at the Mastura and the UN Hull Plan, and I'm talking a lot about it because I was engaged heavily in the civil society and human rights side in the negotiation, the Mastura tried to create what he called CBM, confidence building measures. Confidence building measures to build the confidence between both sides till they reach a permanent peace agreement. None of the confidence-building measures were actually related to human rights. It's all about ceasefire, stop shooting, you stop bombing, and we're good. But if some elements of human rights were included in the confidence-building measures, that will create some confidence. How am I going to trust you and sign an agreement with you when you have my family in prison, or you have the other family just disappeared, etc.? So it's really problematic, and this is one of our missions, actually fighting against any peace agreement. Going to just sweep under the rug everything happened and pretend, oh, this is better for everyone. So some of the arguments in Lebanon, like, oh, nobody had documentation. Oh, we have documentation now. Okay, this is quickly on the universal jurisdiction case, in 10 seconds. The cases are excellent and important. They happen in Europe, but more abstentia cases, and that's the problem, because most of the people who appear to be refugees in Europe are actually more or less from the opposition side, not from the government side. So filing abstentia cases are important, but to follow through and arrest somebody is going to be really challenging and difficult. So we look at them as more symbolic cases, but they're important in pushing the discussion towards the accountability.
Thank you, Mohammed. And I want to also thank the activists of Save the Rest, who reached out to MEI, who worked on this documentary. It's great work. It's always important to bring that voice to Washington, D.C. And I'm very, very grateful to our great panelists, Mariam Raed and Mohammed. Please go and visit the website of Save the Rest on their Facebook page. They have a lot of materials that could be also useful to understand this dimension of the Syrian conflict. And thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you. Thank you.